Hello, and welcome to another week of the Story Darks podcast. I am your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are diving into the work of Jeph Loeb and Tim Sale in the form of Daredevil Yellow, which is a book I haven't spent a lot of time with, even though I am a Daredevil reader, and you are not a Daredevil reader, but you've read this multiple times now.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is one of the few superhero books that I think you, in general, read more, or one of the characters you read more than I have. You have read more than I have. I'd put the Flash up there as well. They're not characters that I ever really connected with. I have nothing against Daredevil. It's just I didn't grow up reading him, and so thus I have no connection to it. I've read a fair share of Daredevil, but it's not a book that I read consistently. I don't read it ongoing. So my experience with Daredevil is effectively like I'm gonna play the hits. I've read most of those. I've read the celebrated runs from some of the big name creators, but it's not a book that I've ever read consistently. And even though I know, especially in the last handful of years, it's been highly lauded, and it's gone from kind of bang up creative team to bang up creative team. It just isn't one that I was historically into, and so thus I'm not into now. But this is a book that I didn't read. The book we talk about next week, Spider-Man Blue. I read that one first in terms of the Loeb Sale Marvel books, and I held off on reading Daredevil Yellow on the sole fact that it's like, well, I don't read Daredevil, I don't know the character. But eventually I broke down and read it simply because I felt the need of like, well, I got to be a bit of a completist here. You might as well read all of them. So, and I'm glad I did, because I think this is a wonderful story. And of course it does change my perspective on it, because I read Spider-Man Blue first, and Spider-Man Blue and Daredevil Yellow, and really all the color books, the two we aren't covering in this set, or I was going to say quadrilogy, to steal a word from the Aliens franchise. All the Loeb Sale color books, these two plus Hulk Gray and Captain America White, they're all structured the same way. They all have the same bones of our main character reflecting back on someone they lost in an earlier part of their publication history. So here it's Matt Murdock, and he's writing a letter back to Karen Page, and having read Spider-Man first, and then coming to Daredevil Yellow, I was more aware of kind of what to expect, and it did, but it didn't hinder my ability to enjoy the story, because while I had less of a connection to the characters, I understood the sentiment. Right. That makes sense. Like I understood what they were trying to do, and so because of that, I understood what the relationships were that were being described. I understood what was going on between these characters, because otherwise they wouldn't be set up in this way that was similar to what I'd already read in Spider-Man Blue.
Yeah, I mean, what is impressed on me now with this book is, if you have seen the Netflix Daredevil series, like season 1, not in a negative way, but very much a beat for beat recap of his relationship with his father, like how he met Karen, the love triangle with Foggy, and it's now, so a lot of that is classic retelling, similar to Superman for All Seasons, but I think since it's a smaller character than Superman or Batman that doesn't have so many iterations of adaptations out there, I think basically anyone who doesn't read comics and knows who Daredevil is, they know the Jeph Loeb, Tim Sale version, even if they have never read Daredevil Yellow and don't know who Jeph Loeb or Tim Sale are.
I would agree. Yeah, this is they're
not that definitive.
They're not trying to do anything radical with the retelling. There are, in this case, they are working through actual plot elements through Daredevil's publication history. They're just, what's different is this is a Matt Murdock from the future narrating about the past. So it's him reflecting on, so so
Right. No,
the
like
original
there's
timeline,
nothing.
timeline is what happens if you read Daredevil effectively.
Right. Yeah. None of the action you see is in real time. It's all in hindsight
There's a little, I mean, like bumper pages at the front and back of issues and things
when
like
he's
that. But
wearing
yeah,
red. Yeah.
exactly. I'm glad you brought up the Netflix Daredevil. This came up. It might have been a few weeks ago. As we're recording this, we're just past San Diego Comic-Con. It actually might have come up before that, but someone had asked Charlie Cox, who was the actor that plays Matt Murdock, or has played him, in this kind of current phase of Marvel at Netflix, and now in this new Born Again, it'll be on Disney Plus. Someone asked him, like, how do you get back into the, what do you do to prep to get back into the character? And he listed off a number of comics that he always goes back to help him get in the right mindset. And unsurprisingly, one of them is Daredevil Yellow. He
That
lists some of the,
tracks.
yeah, he lists some of the greatest hits, but this is specifically one that he talks about and has said that this is one he reads to help him get into the mindset of Matt Murdock. And obviously, you're right, that totally tracks, because this whole book is Matt exploring his own past. It's his thoughts and introspections on the actions that he took and who he was as a younger man, as a younger version of the hero. So there's no better story to get into the mind of the character than one that's written from his perspective, looking back on and reflecting on what's come before.
Yeah. By the way, have you heard Charlie Cox talk about how being Daredevil cost him the Han Solo movie?
No, really.
Yeah, he was in the casting call to be young Han Solo for
Ah,
the Star Wars Solo, Star Wars Adventure, whatever it's called.
damn.
But he was shooting Daredevil or getting ready to shoot Daredevil, and he had done lots of intensive training to avoid eye contact to play Matt
No,
Murdock.
sure.
And so he said he like couldn't kick that. And I think his screen tests for Solo were like, why aren't you looking at the other actors? It's like, sorry, I've been like in this immersed thing where I'm trying to
Yeah.
portray a blind man. Um,
That's
so
well, I don't know. Well, I don't know.
he
Uh,
attributes to that, there are a billion other factors.
yeah. I don't want to blast Alden Ehrenreich here, but I don't know if anyone could have really saved that movie. There's some good ideas there, but it got chopped up after the fact. But
Oh
anyway,
yeah, no, it
I
wasn't made or lost by the actor. Like Charlie
yeah,
Cox kind of dodged a bullet there, honestly.
maybe so. But back to your main point, though, I do agree that this has become a fundamental Daredevil story. Again, even though they're not doing anything radical, they're retelling the early stuff effectively. They're just giving a new polish on
Yeah, it's
the
like here
early
we
run of
saved you 200 issues. Now you can
yeah,
jump
yeah.
right back in.
And you understand who these characters are, because it is so character focused. That's a big thing that Loeb and Sale are interested in their work. Is Long Halloween, it is interesting that we started with that one, because obviously it is so great, but it is an outlier when we look at the books that we have talked about and will talk about. As we talked last week with Superman for All Seasons, like, what happens in Superman for All Seasons isn't important.
Right.
The tornado, the flood, the supervillain that Lex Luthor creates and sets on, whether any poison or what, none of that stuff matters. The actual specifics don't matter. What's important is the various people talking about how they view and Superman and what Superman kind of means to them, and what the idea of him is. The same thing applies here in Daredevil Yellow, where if you know the Daredevil story, then these beats, like when the Fantastic Four show up, when the Purple Man shows up, and things of that nature. So you're not breaking any new ground there. But if you don't know those stories, like I didn't, I never read classic Daredevil. Again, I barely read modern Daredevil, but I didn't
Right.
know these stories. So like when I see the Purple Man, I don't think of Daredevil. I think of Alias. I think of Jessica Jones. That's where Kilgrave is in my mind, because I read this after I read Alias, and he's such a main part of that. But he is and there's connective tissue there, being a street level hero and things of that nature. But because the things that are happening in the story are less important to what's trying to get across from the creators, you don't have to have that previous knowledge. Now you get some fun Easter eggs and things like that, I'm sure, if you do know that. There's a heightened experience for the readers that have that knowledge, but you lose nothing in my mind if you don't know that, because all that matters, all that's really important to Loeb and Sale is you getting in Matt's mind and him talking about these things. That's what their focus is on. So thus, as a reader, that's what we should be focusing.
Yeah. Well, I wonder what you'll think of this. That I think, like, I've read Loeb and Sale's Batman, and I think it's wonderful. It's some of my favorite Batman, but it's the odd man out of this lineup. And I was trying to think, like, what's a Batman story that would actually thematically fit these other Loeb and Sale books? And I'm thinking of, I think it was like a 6 or 8 issue story arc by King, The War of Jokes and Riddles, where it's like,
Yeah, that'd be similar. Mm-hmm.
here's a particular point in time where he's at a new crossroads,
Yeah,
trying to figure out, how to move forward. And in that case, it was his engagement with Catwoman, like whether he wanted to, um, get married or anything, or feels like he could be accepted by her. And so he recounts this story from earlier in his career, reflecting on it in real time, even though the action is all in the past.
yeah,
And I was like, yeah, I think that would be like, I mean, and I think that's clearly Loeb and Sale's influence on King.
Oh, definitely. That, yeah, I think the main structural difference there is War and Jokes and Riddles was invented for the Rebirth run of Batman.
Right.
That wasn't canonical until they wrote it. They said it in the zero-year era.
No, that's a big distinction.
Which was established by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo. So, but no, but I'm with you. It's the same kind of idea. A book that a Batman book in this style would not be Long Halloween. You're right. It would be Loeb and Sale looking at maybe those early detective runs. The ones that like are acceptable and not like wildly racist and terrible, the ones that are actually like haven't been lost to time. They would look at those early issues or the early issues of Batman and retell those classic stories in this same way of him, Batman now today, looking back on that time, which would be a fascinating book because again, Batman is a character that is so internal. You can get so much out of him being introspective, which makes it very similar to Daredevil. And as we talked about last week, very opposite of Superman. Superman is all about how the rest of the world sees him. So that construct of having other people write about Superman makes more sense. Batman's a character that you want to get inside his head. Daredevil's
if you don't get inside his head, there's almost nothing.
Exactly.
And
Daredevil is the same way.
Like Superman.
Yeah, Daredevil is the same way. You want to get in Murdock's head. That's where, that's something that's carried through the idea of, when they really kind of amped up the Catholicism, the guilt and all of that, all the torment, everything inside he's dealing with, that all becomes internal now. And that's what the character kind of becomes going forward. So Batman and Daredevil are characters that are not uniquely suited, but pretty close to it. And so it would have been awesome to see a Batman story by Loeb and Sale in this way. I wouldn't want that in place of Long Halloween because, as you and I talked about, Long Halloween is fantastic, and I want that as is. But that's a different kind of book. But yeah, to get Loeb and Sale on a Marvel Colors type book for Batman, I mean, that would have been awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely take it, and I almost wonder if if they like had one sketched out somewhere that they just never got around to. It seems unlikely.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess. I mean, because they didn't, because that seemed like, to me, it seemed like that was their this is our Marvel gimmick,
Right.
And when they're over at DC, it's like they were doing, but by the time they were established, they were doing something else over there, and it's almost like they didn't want to cross those streams. So I doubt. I mean, I'm sure they had these conversations. I did. They're probably the things that those guys would talk about, but I would doubt they went so far as to have like a pitch, like an official pitch or anything like that. But it would have been great because he's a character that's perfectly suited to it.
Yeah. So getting into this book,
Mhm.
I can tell you from the first 3 pages that this is my favorite Tim Sale art.
Ah, okay.
Now, some of that might be the coloring, but I think it's just, I mean, you open with, the 1 page close up of Daredevil, but then you get the splash page of
Yeah.
doing the iconic roof dives. That's a
Mhm.
lot more detail in the background and the buildings than I think we often get.
That
Um,
that's what I was going to say specific to this book in terms of like there's a lot of brick detail in here, you know?
for
The-
portraying a blind character, which
yeah,
is like
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
have the one character who doesn't see, and you get the clearest picture around him. And I wonder if that was an intentional choice because there's always the juxtaposition of like, oh, he can't see, but he has a better picture of what's actually around him and what's
Yeah,
going
well, but
on.
I don't think they need to I mean, I don't think they need to represent the outside world to the reader the way that Matt sees it. But I mean, I will say before we get off on talking about the colors, and then we'll talk about the coloring, which is done by Matt Hollingsworth, who is still working today, still a great colorist. But you mentioned this splash page here, and the classic Daredevil flip off the roof. Um, Having not read as much Daredevil as you in general, but I know this technique is used where you have a static back image
Yeah.
and multiple versions of the character as they move through. It's one of my favorite effects in comics, and thanks to one of my favorite writers in comics, Kelly Thompson, I know that it's called the DeLuca effect because
Ah,
she uses it in almost every one of her books, whether it's like Black Widow or Hawkeye or Birds of Prey, whatever artist she's working with, she writes this into her books all the time. And I never knew what it was called before, but it's such an iconic idea of how do you represent motion on using a static image. And again, there are plenty of ways to do that with the way you juxtaposition panels and things of that nature. But this way right here, the DeLuca effect is it's one of those uniquely comic things where this only works on in a static image. It only works in a comic, and I love seeing it. And it it makes it's a art technique that makes more sense for some characters than others.
oh, for
You know,
sure.
so
Yeah.
obviously Daredevil. It makes sense for Nightwing. You think about his background as an
Yeah.
acrobat and a gymnast. It made sense for Black Widow. As I mentioned, Kelly Thompson's run. She is a spy, also trained in dance and gymnastics and martial arts and whatever. It it I was going to say it makes less sense for Batman, and it normally does, but there is a fantastic issue of Batman. We keep going back to this Tom King run. I think it was Batman issue 12 of his run. It was, um,
I am
it was,
Bane.
yeah, it was the art was done by Mikel Hanin, and it was Batman breaking into the San Francisco prison, which is Bane's headquarters, and it's done exactly like this because it's actually there's no dialogue except like the first and last page. All the words are a letter that Bruce has written, and so everything is narration boxes, but every page is a double page splash, and it uses the DeLuca effect where you just see Bruce working through the prison so we can ultimately face Bane. And every page turn is a double page splash, obviously, except for the first and last page. But King and Hanin structured an entire comic that way. And again, by using the narration boxes in this way, where it's him writing a letter for I think maybe Catwoman to read. Um, I think it was for Catwoman to read for Selena. Um, it, in my mind, that's like the most direct homage to the Loeb and Sale oeuvre. Their style.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that they use the Luca effect there. I think that was probably just an artistic choice, but I love when it shows up, and it's used to incredible effect here, to the point where it's not just the way the characters are drawn. You see it less in this initial spread when Daredevil's in the red. The modern day with this, the way we read it is, this is like if you're reading this book as it came out. This is Matt Murdock right now, and anytime they cut to that, it's always a monochrome background, and Daredevil is in the all red. But when you see it later, back in the
when he's fighting Owl for sure.
I don't want to
Owly.
the older timeline. Yeah, when he's in the yellow and red, the most foreground image is fully realized color, but all the previous iterations of Daredevil, they're all washed out and lighter. And that's a choice I think that Hollingsworth and Sale made with the art. I think, and that's just to help draw your eye to the front there, so you see that movement. You don't always see that, like when you see it in books nowadays. Again, most of the ones that I can think of, the ones written by Kelly Thompson, when you see that now, you don't see that color gradient change when
Right.
as the characters move through the scene. You don't see it as much, but I
Right.
think it works. Yeah,
And I just slapped this one up on the screen. This is
and
the
that
second page of issue 2.
that's the exact same one I'm looking at here.
Well,
Yeah, so
and you notice that there's fading to the colors.
exactly, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's washed out. It's meant to show, like, almost like it's a way to represent, this is where he has been, right? Like if you're watching like a time lapse or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's very cool. It teaches people how to read comics too.
It does help. It does help.
And I think a character like Daredevil, whose actions like are it can be a bit repetitive. And he doesn't have a bunch of gadgets and tricks,
Yes.
and his fighting style is boxing. It's like,
Yeah, it's a space. Yeah.
it's like, right, but it's like, uh, there's only so much visual interest you can get from a guy with no superpowers who really just swings his arms and punches.
Yeah. Well, and
So
he's
showing
got
his acrobatics.
he's got the clubs, which again
Right.
makes it in this way analogous to Nightwing character I mentioned before, who also that this DeLuca effect works incredibly well with him too, because he's also going to be flipping and jumping and spinning and throwing his Eskrima rods over, and they're going to bounce, you know, I was going to say indiscriminately, but they bounce against the laws of physics, like off a wall, off a table, off a guy's head,
Right.
back to the character,
It's
and then
Captain America's shield. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. But that but by using those types of characters, you can do that effect not just with the characters, but with their weapons. So you can track Daredevil through a scene, you can track the clubs through a scene. So your eye line follows multiple things, and everything's going to start in the back and it's going to end in the foreground. And you can do a lot of fun things with that, and show how Matt would take out a room full of bad guys, a warehouse
Yeah.
full of bad guys, whatever it is.
All right. So I ask this question every once in a while on the podcast, but I'm back in issue 1 here, looking at I think pages 4 and 5. I'll put it on the screen for your benefit, Alex.
Mhm.
People listening may have more trouble,
Yeah.
but when you look at iconic Daredevil standing on the roof, and behind him you've got what looks like ink splotches or watercoloring, but it's black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your inker or your color? Is that Tim Sale's splotchiness on the page, or is that done by the color? And then you see it again the next page. He's
Yeah.
looking at the washed out poster of his
That
father's last
I mean,
fight.
that I think is probably the colorist, because Sale doesn't have an inker. Sale inks himself. I don't know if he does all of that in that manner, especially being that it's monochrome.
Right.
I'm uncertain of that, but because Sale doesn't work with an inker, I lean towards that being on the colorist side.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that being said, I could believe that those backgrounds, when they're washed out and textured like that, I could believe that's all Sale, though. I actually could believe that. But
I could believe it too. I was like,
Yeah.
if I had had the opportunity to buy like a poster print from him, I bet that type of texture would be on a Daredevil print from him.
It probably would be. It probably would be. Yeah. But again, those prints are also like they're if you bought a print from
That
artwork
was
that he
from a
did for
specific book. Yeah, it would be the
it would
finished
have been
product.
it would have been colored by Matt Hollingsworth if you got it from Daredevil Yellow. So but yeah, that you know, I'm a little uncertain of that, but you know, it is it now that I'm kind of flipping through again, there is something about that difference where whenever it shifts from a highly detailed city background where you're seeing like every mortar line on the bricks in the building to when it kind of washes out and you're just seeing, you know, vague shape of building that's darker than what you then assume is vague shape of further back building and then the night sky or something like that, you know.
Right.
There is a nice visual difference there that it helps draw your attention, I think, to what you need to be looking at. You know, if they're not spending detail on the background, then it's not important. What they want you to focus on are the characters or the things that are in the foreground, that are in focus, that are in more detail and color.
Yeah. So let me ask what you think of plot, story, dialogue, you know, what Loeb's like. I think we've talked about his approach to it in terms
Mm-hmm.
of like, you know, it's the reflecting on the past,
Mm-hmm.
kind of an homage to the comics that came before while still treading some new ground with the characters' motivations and depth and emotional processing. But like as a story, do you like the story?
I, I do, and again, my view of this is colored by having read Spider-Man Blue first, so I was primed for the kind of story that we're going to get in terms of what it's about, and it's about our main character, effectively, you know, working through their grief and their trauma over a lost loved one, in this case being Karen Page. I think the thing that's interesting to me about this book that I didn't know at the time, that only came to later as I just had a greater knowledge of the Daredevil character, really just through osmosis, is that the death of Karen Page, when this book comes out, is still relatively new, like incredibly new. Daredevil Yellow comes out in the summer of '98, July '98. I'm sorry, June 2001. I was looking at the wrong line there. It runs June 2001 to January 2002. Karen Page dies in 1999.
Yeah.
So in terms of the amount of time between when this character has died and when we're getting a story about it is incredibly close versus what we'll talk about next week, which is Spider-Man Blue. And of course, I'm talking about publication history, not sliding time scale of the character's history. When Spider-Man Blue comes out in the early aughts, Gwen Stacy's been dead for a long time, you know. So they're revisiting a classic story of Spider-Man versus here, which is an incredibly new, recent story, which came out of the Marvel Knights version of Daredevil. You know, the late '90s were bit of a tough go for Marvel, you know, declaring bankruptcy, things of that nature. But
Pawning off characters like,
well,
yeah.
yeah, for adaptations and things of that. It's why you end up with the Ben Affleck Daredevil and things of that nature. But the Marvel Knights imprint started in '98, and that was a way to try to, it's a little more of a mature line, but they want to bring in, you know, big name talent. And the Daredevil line started off huge because they got Kevin Smith. Kevin Smith was writing, he was working with Joe Quesada, Jimmy Palmiotti. Eventually David Mack comes in. This run is lauded for the introduction of Echo. Maya Lopez, the I think it was issue 9, I believe. So all this is happening in '98, '99, 2000, right as this book, I'm sure, is gestating, because it's right before, it's a couple years before it actually comes out. So if you were reading Daredevil at this time, I mean, I would guess you were pretty stoked that Kevin Smith was coming on. Now, Kevin Smith notoriously is an incredibly slow writer, but at least at the onset, in the late '90s, we didn't know that yet. Now we know it takes Kevin Smith like forever to get a comic script out, but back then you didn't know. So, you know, it would have been a big deal that, oh, this guy who makes movies about reading comics and things like that and has a knowledge of it, now he's writing Daredevil. I'm sure that was a huge deal. And you know, the Marvel Knight stuff is lauded for taking a a new and kind of different approach, a little more mature and adult approach to these characters, to the characters that it covered. So if you were reading Daredevil at the time, I don't know, maybe I don't know if it would have been a shock if you picked up this miniseries that is quote unquote out of it's in continuity, but it's not happening concurrently, and you're getting reaction to a story that you would have just read a couple years earlier, like literally 2 years earlier. So I think that's an interesting choice for them in terms of it's an interesting choice in retrospect. I'll put it that way. Looking at
Well,
when
I
they
think
eventually
you think it's more interesting because you read Spider-Man first,
yeah,
and that was
yeah,
ancient history. I actually think about 2 years after a major event
mhm.
is probably a good time for someone to have emotional processing rather than 30 years, or
Well,
whatever it is.
yeah. Again, we're talking about publication history there, but again, looking back at the characters that go with Bruce Banner and then Steve Rogers, like we're talking about characters that would have died decades before in publication time. So just being 2 years, like 2 years as long as is typically as long as the character stays dead. Like that happens now. After
Yeah,
2 years,
right.
Karen Page comes back. But that hadn't happened here. And so it was interesting to me to learn this after the fact, to realize that it happened so quickly after the event, the inciting incident was happening in the comics. So then it changed a little bit how I read the story. Obviously, the events we're following are the early days, and she goes through quite a bit through the 80s and things of that nature until the point when she actually is killed in 1999 there. But it changes a little bit, not in a bad way, but it puts in more, a little more perspective for me of like maybe they're trying to capitalize on that, or they had an idea for it. I don't know, because they wouldn't have had a lot of lead time in terms of like, this character's dead now. Give me a story about what that, about Matt working through it. This couldn't have been a pitch that has been sitting around for a long time. You know what I'm saying? It had to have been a very recent pitch to them in terms of them coming in and saying, this is the book we want to do.
Yeah, that's interesting to chew on. So I guess my thing is, so I loved the story because for me, having read that after seeing Daredevil season one, just brought back all the warm, fuzzy feelings of like, you know, oh, I know the story of Battle and Jack, and he's supposed to
Mm-hmm.
take a fall and he didn't, and
Mm-hmm.
and they like the Karen stuff, from the comics, as the older comics as well as the show, and Foggy's depiction changes a lot through Daredevil's history, but
Yeah.
he's he's always like a good guy and a little bit of a sad sack.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think they got the essence of that here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I don't understand is it felt like the end of this book just kind of jumped up out of nowhere and put a bow on things that I wasn't sure was earned, where he grants himself forgiveness on like the last page.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how he arrived there, other than I do think, well, as I'm saying that now, I'm like, as you go through the book, it's one of those, like, I don't know if people talk about fridging with Karen, but people who want to talk about fridging will talk about it with anytime a female character dies for any reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
They talked about it with Black Widow and Endgame, and it's like, that's preposterous.
Yeah.
But he is reflecting on this and is like, broke her out of that cage, told her to go. And in his writing, in his letter, he, in retrospect, admires her for not leaving. He's like,
Yeah.
I could never tell you what to do. Like, you didn't listen to me. Therefore, your death may not be entirely on me. You were your own person. And I think that's actually a great level of respect to show to a female character,
Yeah.
especially in comic books, where they
But
are frequently used as props or motivation, or
it's also not entirely true, because I think the basis of his idea is that, like, if we had never hired you, if you had
right.
never walked in,
Yeah.
if Foggy and I both immediately had fallen in love with you and we hired you on the spot, you'd be alive. So basically, if you had never come into my orbit, you would be alive. And so that's I think that's the baseline grief and guilt that Matt's dealing with. This the idea that just being associated with him and thus with Daredevil, that's what
And
killed
that
him.
is
Got to kill.
quintessential Matt Murdock. It's
Absolutely,
like,
yes, yeah,
right or wrong, annoying or
yeah,
not, that is Matt Murdock.
definitely, definitely.
Um, so, um, yeah, but I did just feel like, oh, I didn't even realize he was searching for forgiveness
Mhm.
throughout this book. And at the end, he kind of grants himself that, which is a big character step for Matt Murdock. Again, felt like it just kind of jumped out of nowhere on me.
So, do you think the book is about, I mean, forgiveness, him trying to forgive himself? Because I have a slightly different read on that. Not saying that forgiveness isn't a big part, but do you feel that that is him? He's working through his grief, he's working through his guilt. Do you think ultimately the ability to forgive himself is what the book is about?
I don't, well, that's my complaint is that
Oh,
no, it didn't feel like the book was about that, but it felt like the way it ended, they were trying to say this is what it was about.
okay,
Or
okay,
maybe he didn't even know what he was looking for, but what he stumbled across in his reflection was that he needs to forgive himself and move on, and he needs to just cherish the time he had with her rather than, beat himself up endlessly because she's gone now.
okay, okay.
I think was just really my vibe, but reading for this podcast was actually my first time reading Daredevil Yellow incomplete because it's actually hard to get a hold of.
It is
Um,
difficult. It's
like
not as
I
easy.
can't find a trade new other than dropping $40 on one, and I'm like, I'm not gonna spend $40 on a six issue trade.
'Cause I don't think it's in print. So what they have is what they have right now.
Right. So I've
The
got
last printing
spot
was
single
15 years
issues
ago.
which I've read, but never had the complete thing. So I had to bite the bullet and buy the digital one.
Well, which is it is available there. No, I asked that question because I've been thinking about the title of the book, and obviously Daredevil Yellow can have multiple meanings, and the most obvious one is it harkens back to his early days when he's wearing a suit that is predominantly yellow or just has yellow in it. It's probably equal yellow and red. Obviously, what we think of classic Daredevil is the all red suit, but the version here has yellow in it. I think the next level down though is what is yellow associated with in terms of an emotion? It's fear.
Right.
It's and that's just across the board. And who is Daredevil? What was the subtitle on every comic back in the day? Was the man without fear, right? And so it's intentional, I believe, that it's called Daredevil Yellow. This idea of fear and confronting fear, and I think that's part of what I read Matt working through this fear of loss, this fear that the things he's done or he's not able to do what he can just to save the people that he wants to. And it's like him working through the idea of can't save anybody. I can't let that fear stop me from doing things that I know need to be done. And so it's not about fear of him being blind and jumping off of skyscrapers. It's that fear of I haven't done enough, which is always something that Matt Murdock deals with.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, I love that they pulled out the retro yellow.
Oh, and Leah.
That it was a very smart move. And, Stan Lee has given interviews about this where he says, like, I we were designing a costume. We had to pick a color. So I went with yellow. And they got all kinds of fan letters in the mail. And people were like, really love this book, but yellow, seriously? And Stan was like, well, I don't care what it is. Let's make it red then. And so I pulled up my I've got if you get sometimes the Marvel Epic collections are a relatively random hodgepodge, but the Daredevil Volume 1 is literally issues 1 through 21 of the original Daredevil run.
Nice.
And it is issue 7. It just abruptly switches to red. So it was 6 issues only that had the yellow
Mhm.
costume in the original Daredevil. And so for them to go that far back, it's like, I mean, and there were times where they used it later on,
Yeah.
but always almost tongue in cheek. Like, it was never, I don't think it was ever considered like the cool uniform. But for them to pick up on that and then draw their meaning from the yellow, just like they do with Spider-Man being blue,
Yeah, which
Um,
we'll get to next week. But yeah, it's the same idea. Yeah.
and like I haven't read it, but I can guess what the Hulk Gray, what the
Well,
Gray is about.
yeah,
Um,
when Hulk started, he was gray,
right, but
you know?
but uh there's so much meaning to the color gray
Yeah.
that it's like, okay, well, I see the themes you could start running with there, especially with the Hulk immediately.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Captain America White couldn't begin to tell you other than like purity or something. It's like
Yeah, I think that's probably what it is. I'm not going to reread it to confirm that, but that sounds about right.
my yeah. So my question is like, just how bad could that book be? I'm like, I'm
You know,
reading these and I'm like,
it,
God, they're so good.
it's possible that I'm giving that book too much grief. I will fully admit that, and I will state again, I'm not going to reread it to
But you're
confirm or
you're
change
not
that.
a huge Cap reader either, right?
I'm not, but I'm also not a Daredevil reader. But I
Right.
love this book. And
Yeah.
I read Captain America and White and was just like, never reading that again. You know, it
Right.
was like I only read it because there was such a delay in getting the book out. So there was anticipation. It was like, oh, wait a minute, they're actually going to release this now. Oh, great, I got to read it. And then it became, well, I got to read it because I'm a completionist. You know, like I've already started, I
Right.
got to keep going. But I have no desire to go back to it. I've only read it the one time that I did read it, and maybe it's not as bad as I remember it is. But again, I'm not going to go back and I don't care enough about that book because it didn't make me care enough the first time. That
Yeah.
initial read didn't get me
Well, and there's so
enough
many
to
other
where,
things to read.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I will always make time to go back and read Daredevil Yellow or Spider-Man Blue because I love both of those books. Because when I read them, I connected with them immediately, and that initial feeling is what I can hold on to when I go back to it. That doesn't exist for Captain America White, nor really for Hulk Gray. But again, those are two characters I don't really care about. And so, in by comparison between those two and Daredevil, they're about the same level of how much I care about those characters in general. Maybe Cap and Daredevil a little higher than Hulk, but I have the about the same level of general apathy toward those characters, and yet of those three books, there's one I always go back to.
Yeah.
So I did want to read this one thing. This is from uh, a Marvel event just a couple of years ago, early back in 2022. It was Axe Judgment Day. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically a giant celestial comes out and judges the human race with a old-timey Roman Colosseum thumbs up, thumbs down. And by judging, basically if enough people were judged worthy, thumbs up, good, then the earth isn't annihilated. And if they're thumbs down, then sorry. And what they did in one of these issues was they went through like a bunch of different heroes, and everyone got like a panel, well, not everyone, but each hero got a panel, and you get the Celestials, you get their breakdown, their read of this character. And the Daredevil one is incredible, where it's Daredevil, he's on the street, he's in the rain, he's looking up. You see like knocked out guys like on the ground beneath him, like he's just taking out a bunch of dudes. And the Celestial has this to say. It says, Matt Murdock dresses as a devil and tries to stop the streets from becoming hell. He is a man with a firm moral code, which he has violated time and time over. I appear with a crown of thorns and a turned down thumb. Beneath the mask, he weeps, says, I know, yet carries on.
Nice.
And that's Daredevil right there. Again, he knows what it is he has to do. He knows every time he fails at it. He knows he's going to fail at it. He does it anyway. It's a
Right.
perfect encapsulation. And I think that's what this book, what Daredevil Yellow, to me, is really grappling with, this idea of how do I carry on and continue doing this, which I think puts it in contrast a little bit to the lesson that Clark learned last week in Superman for All Seasons, because Clark can do everything, or at
Right.
least he can do a hell of a lot more than Matt can. So it's one thing for this being, this literal alien coming in, understanding what is right and wrong, what's good and evil, and trying to grapple with how much he can do when he can do so much, versus what Matt Murdock has to do, which is no shots at him, but what he can do, given that he can do relatively so little. In a
Uh,
world of gods and
yeah.
science enhanced people, like he's a street level guy. So what can he do? And how does he overcome that fear and that doubt of not being able to do much? How does he power through when people like Karen are the collateral damage?
Well, and I had to say, I probably issue 4 or 5 when he's trying to locate Karen after she's been taken. It's beginning of 5, I think.
Yeah, I
Um,
think so.
and he is standing at the very tip top of the highest building he can find. I felt a little anxiety for him because I was like, you see that from Batman all the time. He's always like a gargoyle on a building, and it's not a big deal. Like if he slips and falls, he can cape, he's fine. Spider-Man similarly always perched on top of a building because he can web down. If Matt falls slightly too far away from the building, he's just dead. I
Yeah,
mean, or if
no
he
grappling
falls
hook.
right, if
Yeah,
he falls for too long without, being able to deploy his hooks, his arm would just snap
yeah.
when he throws his billy clubs with their tether. So it's
Mhm.
just like, yeah, that this is the character pushed to his limits in a sense, which just shows you like how frail it is.
Yeah.
Um, and so he's definitely the most human, even though he technically has like a supernatural ability that Batman doesn't have. I think he's the most human, most frail of all the characters they did. Loeb and Sale. He's not a
Yeah,
super soldier.
yeah, yeah.
Wasn't bit by a spider. He's not
Yeah,
Kryptonian.
he's street level but he's not. He's a different street level than Spider-Man is. You know?
Right? Yeah. He's like. Uh, I mean, and what I like about what they did in the show was that he was really constrained to Hell's Kitchen,
Yes.
which is like, uh, oh no, he's not Daredevil of New York. He's Daredevil of a neighborhood in New York.
And
Like,
but that's always his thing though. Like he cares about his little plot of land here. This is what
right,
matters to me.
and he's the
You
devil
know?
of Hell's Kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a great setup.
Definitely.
Um,
Definitely.
but yeah,
Well, again,
I just was like, I was very aware of his limitations when he was
mhm,
standing on top of that building. I was like,
mhm.
it's taken him a lot longer to get up there than it takes Batman, Spider-Man, certainly, Superman. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then
Yeah. Yeah.
and then when he has to descend very quickly because he hears Karen's voice, I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of versions of that story where he would just die all the way down.
Mhm,
Because there's
mhm.
no safe way to descend.
Well,
So
he's got to find various things that are sticking out of buildings that he can close enough where he can throw his billy clubs at and
right.
tether to and work his way down. Which is different than
Without getting
Batman's
so much
grappling hook gun.
speed
Yeah.
that when he hooks it, it doesn't just pull the thing down with him.
Well,
So
no,
it's
no, no,
like,
that's
you know, I was just thinking like,
the
man,
physics of
the
comic book
physics
heroes.
of
Yeah.
this. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
and
nebulous.
most of
Yeah.
the time you write off the physics of comic characters because it's like, oh, well, they're special, they're powered, they're
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and they don't really play up his powers at all. I think this is kind of an admirable restraint that they don't attempt to show you
Well,
the Daredevil camera of
eh,
like, the waves or the flames or, whatever people depict his vision as looking like.
and I think that comes from the idea that they're assuming you're familiar with the character, that they're not trying, because again, they're retelling his origin effectively, but it's not about his origin. So you don't need to see all those aspects. They're relying on the reader having a base of knowledge already about the character. And because you already know about the character or have some familiarity with the character, what they want to do is take you inside his mind. So they don't care about what he sees. You know what Daredevil does. You know that he is blind, but he's not. You you're expected to have that little bit of knowledge already. Because otherwise, I think it'd be a waste of time. Do you agree? Like if they had gone back and tried to put some of that in there and be like, we need to explain this or we need to show it, I don't think it would fit in the
No,
story that they're
because
trying to portray.
right, they're trying to tell you his emotional energy and him
Yeah,
dealing with loss.
yeah, not the physical.
And um and the boxing metaphor is great
Mhm.
because
Yeah,
the thing that he was proud of in his father was that, you know, he's like, yeah, he wasn't even always the best fighter, but like he just did not go down or did not stay down.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, which I think they maybe drew up more explicitly in the show, just because they spent a lot more time with it in 24 episodes or whatever. But the idea of him respecting that in his father dying and him getting off the mat, so to speak, him
Mhm.
getting back up, putting on his father's garb, and then going out there and doing this. And whether he realizes it or not, he's facing the same emotional beat with Karen's loss. Is like, oh, I got knocked back down. What am I even doing? Why do I do this if
Yeah.
I can't even protect the people I care about?
Mhm.
And he has that. He's a gritty character, I guess is the way to say it. And it's like
Yeah.
it's slightly different. Like,
I don't like that
um,
term, but I know what you're.
no, I mean grit. Like Angela Duckworth, which is she was the social psychologist who wrote a book called Grit, and she defines it as passion plus perseverance.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
like someone who can just endure. Like her definition was, there was some quote about from Will Smith where he said something like, you know, I may not be faster than you or stronger than you, but I will die on a treadmill. Like I have like my competitive gene is just
Mhm.
like I I would rather die than concede defeat on something. And like that's really what's carried him. It's not his enormous talent.
It's often used as a pejorative, specifically in baseball, specifically with a small baseball player, specifically with a small white baseball player. That guy
Right.
is gritty because
Right.
otherwise, why is that 5'6" guy who is 120 pounds who bats 205? Why is he playing every day? Why is he on a major league team? Oh, because he's gritty. He does things the
Right.
right way. He plays the game the right way.
Yeah, yeah.
He
No, I
hustles.
get that.
He runs out walks and stuff like that. But that it's the same idea, it's the same characteristic that does describe Matt Murdock. That is who he is, the guy who doesn't give up, who approaches every situation the same way, with the same amount of passion, the same amount of effort, the same amount of determination, because he knows that's his advantage. His advantage isn't, you're right,
right.
it's not his skill, his ability. He's not the best fighter, not the best whatever it is. um
But it's an interesting type of it because he is he is he perseveres, he's persistent, but he's so crippled by doubt. Like
yes.
he's always pushing through that.
Yeah.
Whereas like I think my favorite I can't remember, it was one of the comic podcasts I listened to last year. They were talking about like you know, different traits of characters, and someone asked them about Carol Danvers. And he was like, Carol Danvers is just full of piss and vinegar. It's just like this is like she is not a nice person. She's like not here to get along with you. She is just aggressive, upfront,
Yeah.
nonstop energy. And I'm like, I think Battle and Jack Murdock had some of that piss and vinegar. And I think
Mhm.
when Matt gets his head right and he's really scoring off in the moment, he gets that piss and vinegar fight in him where he's just like, I don't care what happens to me, you're going down. Like
Yeah.
you're going
Yeah.
down before I go down. But he
No
doesn't live
nonsense, no BS, not
right.
yeah.
But he doesn't live in that lane. Like he
No,
always has
no,
to like
no.
get knocked out of it, psych himself back up to it. Whereas like a
Yeah.
Carol Danvers just like sets up camp there and lives their whole life in that piss and vinegar lane.
Yeah, and I think it comes, I mean, Carol has a military background. She was,
Right.
especially where she comes from, her creation as a character, or as a woman of power in the military in the 70s or whatnot. So she she's had to put up that kind of shield. But yeah, I think you're right. Matt can get there. And when he does, that's like the platonic form of Daredevil,
Yes.
but he will always come down from that. He will always bottom out and have those times of crippling self-doubt and regret and I'm not saying he's like manic depressive or anything like that, but he has those ups and downs, and that's what's been built into the character over the past 30-40 years.
Yeah. So and I think they get that, right? They're
Oh,
showing
yes.
him
Yeah.
both at his apex and in his cycle.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
once
Well,
he rescues Karen and beats the bad guy, and it's like, bad guy flies away. It's like 9 out of 10 superheroes are like, all right, well, today's battle is done. I got, I rescued it. And he's like, oh, no, you don't. You're not getting
Yeah.
away that easy.
Yeah.
It's like right out the window. It's like,
Well,
against a guy who could fly.
yeah, I think the way they show that is the action being depicted. That's Matt at his best. That's him um, at full grit, as it were. And then all the self doubt comes into the narration. That's all the reflection. So you can get both of those things at the same time. You can see him in action as what he is at his peak, but you can read his thoughts and know that what he's going through now or what he will go through when this thing is done, so is like a complete 180 from the things you're seeing him do, the way he's projecting. And sorry, bad word, he's not projecting. I think he, in those moments, like, he is fully
He's
locked
feeling
in.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. He's not trying to cover anything up.
By the way, this is my favorite page in the entire.
Oh, right. So this is we in issue 5 here.
Yeah, issue 5.
Yeah.
So it's like the bottom
he
panel
jumps
here
after the owl.
where he says,
Yeah.
that's the motto of cowards and thieves.
Yeah.
And then his reflection is, I was young and foolish enough to think that
Yeah.
I could keep this from happening ever again, by doing this. But then he's like on his back over the water.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's like, we're finishing this tonight.
Yeah.
And then it's a reflection about, my father would talk about what it would take to keep a man down in the ring and keep him there. And then you see, like, it doesn't go great for him. It's not like he doesn't have a plan. He's just full of like rage and spite.
Yeah.
But it's like a righteous anger too. I mean, that's also the Murdock thing. Yeah.
I was just going to say that. Absolutely. It comes from this place that it comes from a true believer place, that, like, I in order for me to do this, I have to buy completely in. And that you see that in his actions, but then you get his thoughts, you get the text of the letter that he's writing to Karen. And it's full of self-doubt, so you see that incredible scene that you go through there. And then the follow-up after that is, well, he's tied on to the owl, a villain that can fly, and jumps on his back, and they're over the water. Well, what happens? They fall into the water. And now he's got to try to drag himself and the owl, who he's tied up, back to land. So, like, that was his plan, or what his plan ended up being,
Yeah. By the way, because he can't let the villain die, right? It's not stated here, but that is like a Daredevil thing, is he doesn't kill.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's not even like the street level in him. It's the Catholic in him.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it is. He's and so I found it shocking when he attends the execution of his father's killer, and he says, he's got his. It's even in his journaling. I think he's misleading himself a little bit. He's like, well, I was curious as a lawyer, I wanted to see it, which I think is true. I do think he was like, like, I defend people who might be going to death, or I prosecute people, so I want to know, what this is. But there was a lot more going on in that attendance of that execution. And there's, I think, very cleverly they never have him come out and say, well, I'm Catholic, I'm against the death penalty or whatever. It's, it's like, he just talks about the smell and how awful it was, and how he thought it would be like fighting
Electro.
Yeah. And he's like, it's not, it's just there, and then it's over, and the smell, 3 feet of concrete wouldn't hide it from me.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was just, and that's probably issue 4. I thought that was a very clever way to say, here's like where the line is for this character. And you get that great shot of Matt with the reflection in his glasses of the cap from the electric chair.
Yeah.
Just hanging there.
Yeah.
Before it's attached to his head. But yeah, he said the lawyer part of me wanted to know what an execution was like. And the good son wanted to see it through to the end. And that's kind of but anyway, I felt like, they never state, like, again, it's not a crash course in Daredevil. It's not to get someone up to speed to, like, that. Okay, you read this, now you can read Daredevil. This is like it's both a celebration. So if you've read every Daredevil issue, you'll love this because it's an homage to everything you love. Or if you want to know, like, what makes this character tick, not not an exposition of his superpowers or even his motivations, but like, what's at the heart of this person.
So that actually kind of leads into something I thought maybe we would end with. We'll go here now because you've
Well, I'm all
kind
out of
of,
notes, so this could be
well,
where we
we've
end.
snaked in here, but we've talked about how if you know nothing about Batman, and by nothing, like if you're just pop culturally aware of
He
Batman
wears
and
a
or
bat suit,
Superman,
right?
yeah, if you're just, you've seen some movies and the idea of who Bruce Wayne is and his parents were murdered as a kid and Batman, blah, 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 blah. If you just know what Superman is, baby, destroyed planet, falls in, Smallville, Kansas, raised by two parents, blah, blah, blah. If you just know those stories, that Long Halloween and For All Seasons are books you could give someone and say, this is who this character is. This is the essence of the character. If you read this, you'll understand it and have a better grasp on the full ethos of who this character is. Daredevil is not on that same level as Batman, Superman, and next week we'll talk about Spider-Man. That's just a fact. Would this book be a good starting point for someone to get into Daredevil who doesn't already have some level of Daredevil knowledge? Because I know which way
I mean, the question is really for you because that's your situation, right?
well,
It's like
well,
you were not a Daredevil reader, you were a Jeph Loeb Tim Sale reader,
yeah,
and you
but
liked the book.
I guess maybe someone who's not super into comics,
Mm,
because I can read this and appreciate it on multiple levels outside of who the character is. Like I can look at the way the colors shift, the work that Sale
right.
and Hollingsworth do from, when it's very bright and primary color, like when the background is just like a kind of a palish yellow. When some of the scenes during the daytime in the office and you see the colors of Foggy's suit or Karen's dress or whatever, and then you juxtapose that with the moody grays and blues and blacks of the nighttime when Matt's out as Daredevil. I can appreciate it on a technical level, the way that it's shaded and colored and all of that. But is it a good Daredevil story for someone who, well, I'm having a hard time formulating this question because in my mind, it would be like if someone watched the Daredevil television show and wanted to read Daredevil comics, what would you give them? Well, in that specific case, this would be a perfect book to give
Right.
somebody.
I was just gonna say,
Yeah.
in the same way that I watched Dark Knight and I was
Yeah.
like, I want to read Batman. True
So
Hood gave me Long Halloween. If someone said I watched Netflix Daredevil, I want to read Daredevil, I would give them this.
yeah.
I
So
can't think of any other. But here's the thing: I was gonna say I can't think of any other scenario where I would start them with this. But Daredevil is not one of those characters that has a lot of starting points.
But I was also I agree with that. I was going to say the same thing. I can't think of any other way to start it, but I can't think of any other scenario where someone would experience a Daredevil story and want to know more in the comics and have that Daredevil story not be the Netflix show.
Right. Well,
like
yeah,
I don't
certainly
think
not the
I don't
Affleck movie.
I don't. That's what I was going to say. No one's watching that movie and be like, what I got to do? I got to do more of that character.
But I did have people who watched
No Way Home.
No Way Home and had not seen Netflix Daredevil. And like, first of all,
But
Charlie
that's the same
Cox,
character though.
it's
the same
character.
actor.
Right. It is the same character. But they hadn't seen, like, they would like leaned over to me in the theater and like, who is that? I'm like, it's Daredevil. And all he says is like, I'm a really good lawyer.
Yeah.
It's so good. But
that cameo, second biggest audience reaction in my theater. Was
really?
Daredevil. Yeah.
I mean, it's third. Like the Andrew Garfield one blew the place up.
Garfield was one,
and then Toby finally showing up.
Well, but at least in my theater, I could tell Toby got less because once Andrew Garfield showed up, it was inevitable. Yeah. So if Toby had been first, he would have gotten the biggest one. But that Daredevil scene when he showed up, it was right there. So you did have someone who saw No Way Home and didn't even know it was Daredevil.
Right.
So not just hadn't seen the show, didn't know who the character was.
Right. And I would not have then said, on the way home from here, go get Daredevil Yellow. It's like this really emotionally devastating, sad book. Like, here's your introduction to Spider-Man's attorney in that movie.
But you would have said, go watch the Netflix show.
Yes.
Okay.
Season 1. I say watch season 1 and season 3.
Yeah.
I would straight up tell someone, you can just watch season 3.
I'll say you can watch season 1 and be done. So.
That's true. I thought season 3 was a master slow burn, like no lulls in the season. Like I loved the Bullseye origin story. I loved the like Fisk working from jail, working his way out into a Fed safe house, and then working his way like just like watching him get his tentacles in everything. When everyone has exposed him, they already know who he is, and he still does it anyway. And then kind of all leads to the showdown. Plus, it's Matt going very barebone again. Like he doesn't put on the
Yeah,
red suit because it's
yeah.
compromised. It's back to the Frank Miller ropes on his hands and black
I
garb.
I I agree. It's great, and it's definitely better than season two. I wouldn't put it better than one though. That's tough for me. But I see all your points there. There are some awesome elements in season three
But
of the
certainly
show.
the single greatest scene is the prison escape scene in season 3. It's like a
Oh wow.
7-minute tracking shot.
See, I would say the
Um,
hallway scene in season one because they did it first.
that
They did it
set the
first there.
precedent, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, but that was, that was one small stage. Like
yeah.
it
But
was
that's the
still
whole point, though.
beautiful and perfect,
It's a confined space, you know.
right? But the choreography, the size, like the space, the fact that like very accurately for a street level thing in that prison scene, Matt Murdock was getting out of breath because Charlie Cox was getting out of breath.
Yeah.
There were not stops, there were not takes.
Mhm.
If he had to like swing at a bunch of people and kick someone off of him, he's panting down the hallway, which I feel like a lot of movies don't, which is like, and to be fair, just because I'm saying that's the single greatest tracking shot, like the greatest tracking shot in a Bond movie was at the very beginning of like Spectre, which is not a good movie.
No.
Um, but it was an incredible, starts on the street, goes through the hotel, goes onto the rooftop. Across the rooftop, you see an explosion happen. All of that timing and everything, one long take. Just a masterclass in cinematography,
Well, I mean,
but
but
with
but
no story to tell.
but I mean, something like that though, and I don't know if they did that in Spectre, but like you can do invisible cuts, and I think there
You
are moments in
can,
there where it's stitched together. Doing a fight scene is much harder. A continual fight scene is much harder to build in invisible cuts. Not saying it's impossible, but it's you can do things with camera pans and things of that nature. But yeah, I've been thinking really about like who do you give this book to in terms of someone who wants to read Daredevil? Would this be the one? Because so many people like you're like, oh, I want to read a Daredevil story, and they'll be like, read Born Again. You're like, don't jump in on Born Again, like the Frank Miller, like don't
it's
do
like
that.
jumping in on Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like,
Well, yes, and obviously they're similar, but at least Born Again happens to the Daredevil character that actually exists in Marvel Comics versus Dark Knight Returns, which is not Batman that you're reading, but it's still like you're going to jump in on like the heaviest story. So I don't know, and I guess this because I don't know enough about Daredevil in general.
I
But
think if someone was like, like very recently said, like, oh my God, like I just got the Zdarsky run from the library. It was incredible. Where do I go next? I don't want to go all the way back to the beginning. I think I would say, okay, well, Daredevil to Yellow is next, and
I
then
think that's good.
you're like Brian Michael Bendis, you David Mack covers that era, which is
Yeah,
about the same era as this anyway.
yeah, that's the Marvel Knights
Um,
era. Starts with Kevin Smith. So yeah, you could start there. I think that would work. I think though, if someone was like, I want to prep for Born Again, the new the
mm,
reworked
yeah,
Daredevil show that's coming back with all the same actors, Charlie Cox, Vincent D'Onofrio, Deborah Ann Woll. Everyone's coming back from the Netflix show into this new version. Someone who's excited for that. I guess the assumption, right or wrong, is if you're excited for that, it's because you saw the Netflix show. Otherwise, why would you be excited about all
right.
those characters being back? So if you are excited about that, the presumption is you've watched a Netflix show, in which case then Daredevil Yellow is the perfect book to read before you watch Daredevil Born Again. And I would almost suggest don't read Born Again because we don't know how much of I, I just get the sense they're using the title as both a homage to the comic and a meta
Because they
reference to it
basically
being
did
Born
Born Again
Again.
already in season 3.
Well,
Like Matt
exactly.
Murdock was like dead,
Yes.
and
And
he
so,
was just
again,
living in a convent.
yes. And so Born Again is also a meta commentary on the fact that the show and the characters now live again. You know, it was
Right.
canceled and it's back. So I imagine it's not going to have as much actual born again from Miller and Mazzucchelli in terms of actual. They're going to, oh, they're doing born again. No, they're probably not. Could be wrong about that. I'm leaning heavily on the side of they're not going to do that. But at that point, Daredevil Yellow would be the perfect book to, if you've seen and you have experienced some Daredevil, some Matt Murdock.
Yeah.
This is a book.
What about someone whose only exposure to Daredevil, which this is an insane hypothetical. What if their only exposure to Daredevil was in the She-Hulk show?
Uh, no, because
I agree.
um,
Even though he's wearing the yellow suit, which was awesome.
yes, which is great to see. That was awesome, but only because this is about he's he's parachuting into someone else's story. You know,
Well, and he
there,
was so much happier in that. And that one
yeah,
was more focused on him as an attorney.
it
There's
was, it
no
was.
courtroom scene in this one where he's the attorney, right? He attends a
Uh,
trial for his father's killer, but
I
he's in
think there's some.
attendance.
I think, or that may have been mock trial before he even
Yeah,
finally
yeah.
graduated. Yeah, I mean, because the whole idea is them setting up
Right.
their law
It's
firm, their
Nelson and Murdoch.
practice. Yeah,
Um, but that's such a huge part of the character, and that was why he came to She-Hulk, because they're both
yes,
attorneys.
yes.
Um,
It was the legal aspect, and the super aspect was secondary. So no, I would not say that. I would say though, if you like that, even though he is much happier, it's a different tone of the show. Like if you're connecting with that, it's because you're connecting to Charlie Cox because I think he is
right.
phenomenal. He's
Yeah.
so good. He's one of those actors that gets a they cast him so well, and you're like, well, that guy now is Daredevil. He puts on the glasses and he has the stick, the cane. You're like, well, that's Matt Murdock. Like that's who
I
he
mean,
is
have you
now.
seen his like Comic-Con pranks that he does with people?
Oh yeah,
Where he
yeah.
goes in a Spider-Man costume,
Mhm.
he sees someone in a Daredevil costume, and he's like, "Oh, cool! Can I get a picture with you?" And makes
Yeah,
them use their own phone, which doesn't make sense, but people don't question it.
yeah.
And right before they
He takes
like
yeah,
take the picture, he rips his Spider-Man mask off.
yeah,
And when they get home later, they realize they're in their Daredevil costume and they have a picture
yeah,
with Charlie Cox.
yeah.
It's like the coolest fan-loving thing I
Oh
can
no,
think of.
he is fantastic and he's perfect in the role. So if you liked him in that, then the thing is, well, then go back and watch the Netflix show. Everything goes back to that because I think that adaptation is so good. Overall, it's so good.
What right, and that feeds so much off of this that by the
Yes.
time you watch even just season one or the first half of season one,
Yeah.
you can read Daredevil Yellow and just
Yeah.
love it.
But I
Aside from
weirdly, I
the small spoiler that Karen at some point dies.
well, yeah. But so weirdly, I don't know if I would give this book to someone before they would watch the show because it's not an adaptation of Daredevil Yellow, but it's thematic and it's
No,
emotional
it I would
influence.
say it has the same relationship to the show that Long Halloween has to Dark Knight. It's like
Yeah,
there are
yeah, yeah,
images and moments and
yeah.
ideas,
So
like iconic Batman moments that are lifted from this story and put into
it's a
the
vibe
show.
adaptation. It's an emotional
Yes,
adaptation,
right.
and it's a thing that we speculated last week about the new Superman movie from James Gunn and Peter Safran that allegedly rumored to be influenced, quote unquote, by books like All Star Superman and Superman for All Seasons. It's the vibe, it's the feeling, it's the sense of that book, it's the heart, the gist of the book, not so much the story. So I don't know if that works for a character like this if you don't have if you aren't already interested in it. I I do think though, I think it does still work as a very good story. If you don't know the specifics, I think it can still work. I think the storytelling is strong enough. You
I'm gonna test it.
obviously
I'm
someone
gonna
won't.
give a copy of this to my uncle who he like trolls me for comic books when he's in town, and he'll be in town next month. I'm gonna give him this one and not say anything about it.
Yeah.
Just pass it to him and see what he thinks. Uh,
And to see if he
because
connects with the story, connects with the characters.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, no, he was looking at my shelf last time he was here, and he was trying to self-select things, and I had Doomsday Clock right next to Watchmen. He's like, I love Watchmen. I was like, yeah, that's like the follow-up series. He's like, oh, can I read that? I was like, Yeah, I mean
You
you
can.
can.
It's fine.
It's like it's
It's
fine.
fine.
I was like, right, but it's not in any way a satisfying chaser if like you've read five things ever and one of them is Watchmen.
Yeah, yeah.
Like number six should not be Doomsday Clock. Um,
But no, I'd be curious because I tend to fall into the camp of Loeb and Sale are good enough storytellers, um, that the heart of the story moves on and can be interpreted and felt, even if you don't know who the characters are or what the relationship is beyond what you're seeing on the pages, which is their introduction to each other. And yet it's very clear that what Matt Murdock is talking about is a much longer life experience with Karen. He's not talking about the Karen that first walked into their law office. He's talking about a Karen that's lived a much longer and much more eventful life. So even if you don't know that, I still think the heart of it can translate and work its way through. At least I choose to believe that because I have so much belief in Loeb and Sale as storytelling.
I am pretty sure I agree with that. I I think some of it will be like you won't have a full appreciation of it. But I don't know anyone who wouldn't enjoy at least the first three issues or so where you get the story with his dad, right?
Sure,
And
sure.
so it's like and
But maybe when
and
the villains come in, when there's Electro, the Owl,
right.
the Purple Man, things like
Which
that.
honestly I think the best case for this being one of the first Daredevil books you read, especially if you watch the show, is that the show steers pretty far away from the supernatural elements, as does this book. It's like, yeah, there's a like a villain with some powers, but he's not going into hell fighting a demon, which does happen in Daredevil books. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like
yeah,
that's
yeah,
a very jarring Daredevil
yeah.
to give to someone who's like following the MCU or the Netflix Marvel stuff. Like that's just a totally different vibe. That's like, if someone says they're into Batman and you give them a Constantine book, it's like, yeah, it's jarring to go from street level to like angels and demons battling.
This is true. But again, they again they're they are they're going through the first 5 6 issues of Daredevil though. So those are the villains. He gets like only a brief cameo, but the Masked Matador, he shows
Right.
up. And that's one of the first issues as well. So it's intentional what they're going through and showing you, and that those are the villains he was fighting at the beginning of his time. Um, I just don't know how much that translate or how much it needs to translate because again, I don't know all those stories. And hell, even Spider-Man, as we're going to talk about next week, does the same thing. It covers a very specific run of comics of Amazing Spider-Man. That was well before I was ever reading it, and books that I've only read some of, just like through collections or whatnot, years and years and years and years later. But they're running through those specific events in those comics and using those characters and taking some liberties here and there in terms of maybe the order of things, but those like Daredevil fights Electro in this because he fought Electro in an early issue of Daredevil,
Right.
Purple Man, the Owl, all that stuff is there. So you don't necessarily need that knowledge because I didn't have it, but I have a base knowledge of Daredevil and Matt Murdock and of Foggy Nelson and Karen Page and all of that. I know
And
who
you
these
own a
characters are.
phone, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I don't like to treat
Well,
readers as
yeah,
if they're stupid. So it's like,
but I didn't when I first read this. Like cell phone,
that's
I read
true.
this in the early mid aughts, a handful of years after it came out. Like we didn't have that. The internet still existed, but like you're not looking stuff up in the same way. You don't have that same kind of access. It is different now.
Yeah. That being said, it really takes me out of a book when I have to stop and Google stuff. And I'd prefer
Yeah,
to just keep reading and, figure out what I can. And there is like, I think the thing that you and I probably like underestimating, like, is it the optimal starting point for a character? No, nor is it intended to be. But there is the reality that every issue is someone's first issue or has the
yes,
potential to be.
of
And
course.
and I think you could do a lot worse than Daredevil Yellow if it was your first issue of comics ever.
I would agree. I would agree. I would
Because
agree.
it's like yeah, you may not know who all the characters are, who's going to be important, yada yada. But it's a small cast of characters. There's not a lot of names to learn. It's not like
Hmm.
picking up a Justice League book and you're like, oh, I
Yeah.
remember, I know that guy and that one, and then the robot, and then who's that guy with the feathers? It's like, it's a lot of characters to keep track of in certain books. This one is a small cast, and the storytelling is masterful.
Mhm.
The artwork is compelling and clear
Yes.
and
Hmm.
vivid. And so it's like, yeah, in that sense, like it meets all the technical requirements of great storytelling, great book. And for that reason, I think basically anyone could.
I think so. I think you're right. I think those elements will have the potential to overcome someone's absence of knowledge of the character or of superheroes in general. But like if it's a really good story, it's told in compelling is a great word. It's told in a compelling way. It's told in a compelling way. Let's use proper tenses here. Um, the idea of the letter and all of that. I think there are elements that you can. There are storytelling elements outside of the superhero aspects that anyone can grasp onto.
Right. If you didn't know who Karen was, it wouldn't really matter. Like you basically pick up everything you need. You get how they met, she's dead.
And she's important. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right. And it's like, yeah, you don't, I mean, you don't like, you could go look up now, you could go look up, how did Karen die?
yeah.
But it doesn't matter for the story because what matters is how he's processed.
Exact, which is why it's not part of the story. It's not part of. He's
And
not recount.
I'm
He's not
very,
recounting
I
how she
love
died.
their restraint for stuff like that.
Exactly, and that I'm 100%. That's a great point to bring up. It's not about that. It's not about how she died. If you want to read that, go back and pick up the Marvel Knight stuff from a couple years earlier. Go read those issues. You can find out how she died. This is about how he wants to remember those early days, how she came into her life, his life, and how that set in motion things that maybe he has to still deal with and process, but they're not showing that because that's not what the draw is here.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
that's not what we're doing here.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, well, like I said, I probably 20 minutes ago now.
Yeah.
I've reached the end of my notes. Clearly, I could talk about this book forever, but we want to leave something on the table for Spider-Man Blue next week
Yep. Yep.
because I
Yep.
know that's an all-timer for you,
It is.
and I know that I need to repent and come around on that book. I don't know if I was just like tired or in a bad mood or something when I read
It's
it, but
possible. It happens that it affects the way your perception of a book. And again, it's possible that the similar thing is happened with me and Captain America White. But I'm not going to go find out. Um,
yeah,
you know,
well, but like this one, I've just, it's like, I think I felt the way about Spider-Man Blue, and we'll get into this next week, that I think a lot of like longtime Superman fans who didn't like Superman for All Seasons feel, which was just like, there's nothing new here. Like,
well,
and it's like,
and yeah,
that's the wrong
there.
approach to a Loeb Stale
Yes, there
book.
is and there isn't because that's only about that. That's focusing on the action of the story,
Right.
not the message of the story. So yeah, we'll get to that next week. My last thing I was going to mention earlier, and I skipped ahead in my notes because we
Letters.
were going to attack. Yeah, it is the letterer. The letterers, Wes Abbott and Richard Starkings. Richard Starkings again, and I want to call back that once again in the three books now we've seen is the similar tact of again dialogues in all caps. Matt's letter
Yep.
is in mixed caps, and I hope at this point now, since we've been talking about it, it's something that you see and recognize. And I hope people appreciate that. But it's those little things that set a book like this apart because there is this idea of mixed case looking and seeming more handwritten. You know,
Right.
yeah, that's how folks typically write, quote unquote, typically write. And so those little things, and I like that they've carried that over, that same stylistic choice that just makes a clear differentiation of not that it's hard to tell between a dialogue box and a narration box, but it's those little touches that shows they care that this is separate. And it also helps to differentiate that these aren't well, I guess they are current day thoughts. You know what I'm saying? Like they're not narration boxes for what is happening. They're narration boxes for his recollection of what's happened. You know?
Right.
They're not explaining the action as it's happening. They're explaining the action as he remembers it. And it's those little differences, that attention to detail that I love to see in books, and in books like this that utilize this kind of storytelling mechanism, this storytelling conceit that they have.
Yeah, which that I mean that just makes me want to talk about Spider-Man Blue because
Yeah.
I was wondering how much of the storytelling was tinted through the lens of like an 18, 19-year-old guy
No,
versus
sure. Yeah.
objective reality. And
Yeah.
I think that was one of the things that was unclear to me. And, in this story, I do think we pretty much see the facts as they happen, and the coloring is done through the narration from Matt. But, that could be wrong too. Maybe, well, that and we get knowledge in this story. This is interesting that Matt doesn't get. So Matt is telling us a
Yeah.
flashback, and you see Foggy, walk in with flowers and then walk
Yeah.
back out the building and throw them away in the street.
That's an incredible 3 panels
It's incredible.
where it just
However, Matt's telling a story, and
it
Matt couldn't
shifts
have known
it
that.
shifts yeah it shifts a little. That's an incredible 3 panels. Not my favorite sequence, but it's up there. But you're right, we get that, but there's no indication that Matt knows that, or at least not
Other
knowing
than Matt,
in real time.
he had said, I'm going to propose to Karen, which is a wild thing to say when you're
Yeah,
not even dating her.
we're not getting into that, but
Yeah.
it is the kind of thing that you could plausibly argue that Matt learned about after the fact.
Right.
Like these are conversations that him and Foggy had later. There's a
Or Matt walked out of the
plausibility
building, smelled the flowers, smelled
Yeah.
Foggy's perfume on it. I mean,
Or
that's a
even
very Matt Murdocky thing.
even as it's happening, because
Right.
in that sequence we see Foggy come out the front door and walk to the trash can there. Matt and Karen are above in the office, and the window's open, presumably. So there's ways around that there. But yeah, it's little bits like that. I don't know. I think
It's such a beautiful panel that I
it
decided
is.
to let it go.
It is. That page, that sequence is so wonderful. It's so good. But yeah, I'm sure there's some nitpicks like that where you would, because the way the story is, the storytelling mechanism is framed and used, you question of like, well, how would you know that? And I think the answer is, well, it's been several years since this happened, and so he's filled in the gaps now. It's that
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, good call out on the letters. I noticed that as well with, the mixed case, all caps.
Mhm.
Not unheard of, but it is always
No.
helpful, especially since like the caption boxes were white, narration boxes were off-white, yellowish.
Yeah. It
But
made it
pretty
seem like
subtle.
it was. Yeah, but the idea that I think there was a little yellow tint to them. It almost made it feel like it was like written on yellow paper, that kind of thing.
A
you
legal
know,
pad.
exactly.
Which,
Yeah. Since he is actually writing a letter. But yeah, it's little things like that. It's not necessary to a story, and I don't think it fundamentally changes it if it's all the same font and font style. But just the fact they put the effort in and they understand that those little things can what elevate a book. Even though they go unseen, they don't go unrecognized. Your subconscious will pick that up. Those are the kind of subtle unseen clues or unnoticed cues, kind of that just can elevate a book in your mind, and you may not even know why.
Right.
It's those
Yeah.
little touches.
Well, that and like, the little thing of like the texture and the detail of the backgrounds in this book are the type of things where like you can't quite put your finger on it the first time you're reading it, but then you go and read a lesser book and you're like, why does the art feel worse?
Yeah.
The character still looks the same.
You have
but
to
the
be
art
looking
feels
for
worse.
it. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Well, why don't I get the same feeling out of this panel
Exactly.
in this
Yeah.
page
Yes,
than
that's
I
a better
do
way
from
to
this
say it.
book to another? Yeah, no, you're totally right there. Yeah, it's because what they're manipulating on the page for for what visual cues you're supposed to get from it is different, and that That sort of thing is part of the genius of Tim Sale here and the books that he does. And I think the work specifically in this book with Matt Hollingsworth is so good. And you're right. There's storytelling in and of itself just in the art. Because again, Tim Sale is someone whose books I can go through and read without reading any dialogue, you know? So nothing against the writer or the letterer. I can skip all of that and just look at the art. And have an incredibly fulfilling experience.
Yeah,
Yep.
totally agree. Yeah, so I mean, Loeb and Sale on this podcast are 3 for 3 so far. And each of these three, I think, are books that I can go reread without reading.
Yes,
Like
100%.
It's which is a great tribute to Tim Sale.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just like the stories are pretty well burnt into my brain. It's like some of the details of the crime families and stuff like that in Long Halloween.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, you do a little bit of reading there, but like Daredevil Yellow, Superman for All Season, you can just flip through these anytime.
Because the story doesn't matter. Long Halloween is a mystery story. You need some details there. It helps to know that one. But once you do, and you know generally who's who, you can work your way through. But for All Seasons and Yellow, these last 2 books, these last 2 weeks, it's a vibe check, you know. Right. It's just a feeling of when you're in it, and the art will tell you how you're supposed to feel. When you get to a mostly monochrome page with a in-color Daredevil, like, you don't need to know what's on that page, what's happening, to know that something's different there versus a midday, very bright, sunny, colorful panel in the law offices of Nelson and Murdock when Karen, Matt, and Foggy are all there. You know, just by looking at it, you know what you're supposed to feel. You know what the characters are supposed to feel and what they are feeling just based on that. You don't need the words, and that's the power of the storytelling of in Tim Sale's work.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for reading, and thank you for listening. And grab Spider-Man Blue, much more readily available than Daredevil Yellow.
Issues 1 through 6. Actually, rarely available on all sides. You can probably find those issues. Well, you can find them more easily than Daredevil Yellow. But you'll definitely find the trade.
The trade is still in print. Yeah,
it's been reprinted much more often and much more frequently than Daredevil Yellow. So I think Spider-Man Blue is probably the most highly acclaimed of the Color series. If I had to guess,
without a doubt, yeah,
it's the most widely read. So that one shouldn't be as hard to track down.
Great. We will see you next week, and join us for Spider-Man Blue, and we wrap up our Loeb Sale month. Or at least I think we're wrapping it up. That's our last planned book.
I think so for now.
See if we have any more whims. But anyway, see you then.
Peace.